I'll keep my.
Good afternoon, everyone. Respected Chairman of Indian Academy Education Trust, Dr. T. Somshekar, Secretary, Mrs. Bharti, Chief Operating Officer of Indian Academy Group of Institutions, Dr. Srinidhi K. Parthasarthi, Principal of Indian Academy Degree College Autonomous, Dr. E. Jerome Xavier, the guest speaker of the day, Dr. Payal Ghosh, faculty members and students, a very warm welcome to all to this international webinar on truths about heavy resistance training, why it is good for all of us, organized by Department of Physical Education, Indian Academy Degree College Autonomous. It is said that health is wealth. Your health is at the center of your life. A healthy mind resides in a healthy body. On behalf of Department of Physical Education, I extend a hearty welcome to all the participants, and I now invite our principal to introduce and welcome the resource person.
Dear participant and the resource person, Dr. Payal, we are extremely delighted to have you with us this afternoon to share on a topic on which not many of us have sufficient knowledge. Maybe our understanding on the topic is at the peripheral level. I'm sure today's sharing by you will enlighten us and give us a wider perspective on health. I'm glad to introduce Dr. Payal Ghosh, who has excelled herself in the field of physical education, having completed her PhD in exercise physiology from Florida University way back in 2014. Dr. Ghosh had joined the Department of Nutrition, Food and Exercise Sciences, College of Human Sciences, Florida University. Currently, she is a program director for the sports sciences and teaching faculty at Florida State University. Ma'am, it is good to know that you are a certified strength and conditioning specialist, National Strength and Conditioning Association. Dr. Ghosh has many awards and achievements to her credit. To name a few, National Space Biomedical Research Institute's Pre-Doctoral Gravitational Physiology Award, American Physiological Society, Jane Addams Edmonds Endowment PhD Fellowship, Florida University, Public Health Honors, the Johns Hopkins University, and so on. In addition to all these awards, academically, Dr. Payal Ghosh seems to be very, very sound and excellent, which is reflected through her publications and research articles. To her credit, she has published 17 articles in reputed international journals and 12 abstracts and posters. I don't think we could have any other person to speak on physical health than an expertise in the field of Department of Nutrition, Food and Exercise Sciences, all the way from Florida to Indian Academy Degree College audience. Ma'am, we are fortunate to have you with us this afternoon, and I'm sure your sharing would not only be a delight to our ears, but it will ignite the minds of our students to take up physical exercises and health seriously. Thank you, ma'am. Over to you.
Thank you for that introduction. That was very kind. Let's see, let me go ahead and start sharing my screen and then I'll go forward with today's topic. Give me 1 second. Let's zoom. Okay. Is it sharing?
Yes, we can see that.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
And then what I will do, even though I teach almost every day using Zoom, I'm still very slow with it. So I am just pulling up the chat function also. In case any of you have questions as I'm speaking, I can try to get to those questions while I talk. Otherwise, we can save questions for the end, but feel free to through chat, or if you just want to ask your question through audio, to be able to do so. So I guess a couple things to let you know a little bit more. That was a great introduction and gives you a little bit about my background. Something I probably will add is it may have seemed that there's a bit of a disconnect for me because my PhD was in exercise physiology. During it, I spent a lot of time, the lab that I worked in, we were mainly funded by NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Association. And we did a lot of work looking at vascular function as it affects those who are exposed to weightlessness and space radiation, which is what happens in space. So we were taking a look at that. However, also in my training, I did my master's focusing primarily on strength and conditioning. And in my position now, that's what I do. Again, I focus on strength and conditioning. I've developed our sports science curriculum here, which focuses on strength and conditioning and advise the students, help them get to where they want to be in that particular field. And so with today's talk, I have to be honest, as I was thinking about what I'm going to talk about, I was having a really hard time picking a topic. And talking with one of my coworkers about it, trying to see like what would be something that's interesting, we got off on the topic of heavy resistance training. And something I can let you know also about myself is my whole life I've participated in weightlifting in some way. I've been in sports since I was young, generally weightlifting as a supplement to my sport, and more recently weightlifting as a sport itself and to just remain healthy. So in our conversation, we started to talk about how we somehow got onto the topic of heavy resistance training, how as I started to participate in that more, my mother would always say like, that's nice, Payal, but when are you going to stop? Like, it's about time that you give this up. And even amongst coworkers here, a lot of people seem to be against lifting heavier weights. And that's been something that I wanted to share with people everywhere in terms of heavy resistance training is good for you. It can be good for you as long as you do it right. And we just need to know more about its benefits and why it may not be as scary as some people think it is, which is a big barrier to why people choose not to have or participate in heavy resistance training. So before I get into that, I'll cover some of the basics that we probably already know in terms of let's just look at things that lead to death. Like whenever there's a talk on exercise, pretty much everyone starts with, well, we want to exercise because it keeps us healthy. And I'm kind of doing the same thing. So if we look globally at the various causes or the leading causes of death, we see, and granted this isn't the most up-to-date statistic, but we see that the majority of causes or leading causes of death are the result of chronic diseases. Heart disease being one of the top, stroke, COPD, respiratory diseases and such. Now, on the left, what you see are the leading causes of death in the US. And something to just let you know about those of us here in America, we are the type that, you know, it's our right to look down at our phones as we cross the street, not watching where we're going. So we're kind of klutzy. Accidents kind of make it in the top 3 as far as leading causes of deaths for Americans. That's supposed to be a joke. But otherwise, when we look at some of the main causes of death in the US, we see that 7 of those 10 main causes are, again, the result of chronic diseases. And now even in India, when we take a look at what are the top leading causes of death in India, we find that 6 of the top 10 are, again, chronic diseases leading to death. Now, the good news here is that in both of our countries, we made it in that we are no longer dying from greatly from communicable diseases. Present situation not included with COVID, obviously. So with better medicine and access to healthcare and better drugs available, again, these viruses and other diseases aren't killing us. And so instead what happens is that our own body starts, so we live long enough that we're not dying from these other communicable diseases, which gives us time then for our own bodies to attack us, right? That seems to be the trend that we're going in. The only thing with that is that it's not really that our bodies are attacking us. The problem is that we aren't treating our bodies properly or treating it as well as we could, leading to all of these chronic diseases developing in the first place. So when we take a look at what are some of the main risk factors for the development of chronic diseases, we find that tobacco use, poor nutrition, where at least in the US, poor nutrition refers to not having enough to eat, but to choosing high fat, very processed foods over eating just fruits and vegetables and whole foods. We see that there is a lack of physical activity and also excessive drinking, which is a big problem, at least in the US. All of these risk factors for increasing our risk for chronic diseases are things that are within our control. We have the ability to not smoke, to eat well, to be physically active, to drink less, and in doing so, to reduce our risks for chronic disease. Now, of these risk factors, the one that is most close to home for me is the one related to lack of physical activity. So if we take a look at the WHO, the World Health Organization guidelines for physical activity, what we see is that their guidelines for how much activity we should participate in to be healthy involves either participating in 150 to 300 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic exercise per week, or if you would like to do something of higher intensity, to participate in 75 to 150 minutes of high intensity aerobic activity per week. Also within their guidelines, we see that they recommend that you should participate in some sort of muscle strengthening activities at least twice a week. Now, one thing to just kind of tell you about that a little bit, there are much more specific guidelines that we see from the WHO in terms of what we should be doing for aerobic exercise. When it comes to resistance training, however, what we see is that it's very general. We should just do some sort of resistance training twice a week, but that's not a very good guideline for being able to indicate what would most optimally impact us and improve our health. Now, one thing we also see that is here in the US with the CDC is that one of their recommendations, because Americans are very inactive, and getting Americans at least to be able to participate in any of this is very hard to do. So they've added into their guidelines that, like, okay, if you can't meet these guidelines, that's okay, just do something. Move a little bit more than you're moving now and sit a little bit less. And this is definitely something that we need to be hearing right now, considering with COVID, many of us are stuck at home and unfortunately are sitting that much more than we may have ever been in our lives. So I see a question that I have here is, would it be considered, or would this be what is considered, I assume that's high intensity training, high intensity interval training. Yes, that is part of it in terms of high intensity interval training is definitely a way to include weight training, potentially weight training and aerobic fitness to be able to be that much healthier. It's a great way to go. So Americans, we need to just move more. And I think that probably in the country right now, or not the country, the world right now, we all just need to be moving a little bit more, right? Now, based on these guidelines from the WHO, what we find is that in the US, amongst adults, only 1 in 4 Americans meets these physical activity guidelines. And from what I could find in studies and articles about India, only 1 in 10 Indian adults meet these guidelines also. So we all kind of could try to do a better job to be able to move more. Now, our kids, at least, they are better than us, which is great. They are that much more active than we are. I pull this from a study that was a review looking at throughout the world, the prevalence of physical inactivity amongst kids, separating it between boys and girls, while also looking at changes over time from 2001 to 2016. So a couple things to just note here as far as what we see in terms of trends. Generally speaking, again, our kids are more active than we are, which is great. What we do see that to me is something that bothers me as a woman is that we generally find that girls are less active as a whole than boys are. And some of that may be cultural. I probably, to be honest, like a lot of that is cultural throughout the world, but we see this. The other thing though that we see, so this is what's great actually, is if we take a look at South Asia, and the US fell in the high income Western countries, we see that both India and the US lead the charts in terms of our kids being the most active. So that is awesome, right? Our kids in both of our countries like are doing great. And what we see as far as what I recall from differences between India and the US is that American boys, for whatever reason, tend to be a bit more active than Indian boys are. I think it has to maybe do with the level of organized sports that there are in the US. But what is great to me is that Indian girls are much more active than American girls are. So like, you're killing it over there. That's awesome. I think that's awesome, at least. Now, what is an unfortunate trend that we see here with this particular study is that when looking at changes in activity levels from 2001 to 2016, we see that amongst boys across the world, that they have become more active in that 15-year time span. However, for girls, nothing has really changed. And so I'm just letting you know as we go through that that is something that I think about a lot, is not only getting people as a whole more active, but I also feel that women could do more. We should try to do more to be active, and it's, you know, good for all of us. So that being said, though, to get into it a little more, when we look at, so this data I pulled from, there is an organization in the University of Washington that has looked globally at various countries to be able to determine health status in all of the different countries. So for India in particular, looking at some of the main risk factors that drive both death and disability together, what we find is that the top 4 of the top 10 risk factors driving death and disability in India are things that are in some ways within our control. So we've got high blood pressure, high fasting plasma glucose, high BMIs or body mass index, and high LDLs. These are things that can be addressed to an extent, or to a great extent, to be honest, with improving our physical activity by moving more, being more active. And what I see with this trend here, so it's looking also at the differences in the highest risk factors in 2017 is what we're looking at, but we're also looking at the change from 2007 to 2017. And what we see is that in particular for the 4 that I highlighted here, not only are they part of those high or top risk factors, we see that they're greater in prevalence amongst Indians than they had been 10 years ago, which is also another problem. It is another indicator that, again, hey, we could be exercising, we could try to be more active to reduce these risk factors of death and disability. So I was speaking to my mother about this to tell her that I was going to talk to you all about heavy resistance training. And I could, even though I was talking to her on the phone, I could tell that her reaction was, oh gosh, Payal is going to speak about lifting heavy. Are you not going to talk about exercise at all, just exercise and aerobic training in general? So to appease her in a sense, I want to just say briefly in terms of just exercise as a whole, why do we do it? How is it helpful? Acutely, there is a lot to show that just after one bout of exercise, we find that we are happier, our mood improves. There's a lot of research to show that in those with anxiety and depression, which is also becoming more prevalent, and probably even more so now with COVID and being isolated to a higher degree, that with some sort of physical activity and exercise, it helps to reduce those levels of anxiety and depression and makes us happier. We can see that acutely just after a bout of exercise. That night when you hit the sack, you go to sleep and you sleep better, fall asleep faster, and can sleep longer from having performed that exercise. When it comes to just not acutely, but more chronically, as far as what exercise does for us, based on what I showed you before, I think we can all agree that it will, yes, reduce the risk of our development of chronic diseases. Because of that reduced risk of chronic disease, we see an increase in our life expectancy. Along with that, with exercise, whether it be aerobic in nature or heavy resistance training in nature, it helps to improve our muscle and bone strength, makes us stronger, increases the density of our bones, which in doing so allows us to just live our life easier. It's that much easier to carry out those daily activities of living. Going up the stairs is less of a chore than it had been had you not exercised. We find that if you, well, at least here with the way our grocery stores are, we have tons of bags of groceries that we have to carry into our house. You can carry more of those bags at once than you could had you not exercised. Doing just the general things that you do every day, that much easier than it had been before. And as far as with one of the questions, is there a direct correlation between exercise and general happiness? Yes, particularly, and what I can say is that most of the research done on that has been on aerobic exercise in particular, where there is a high degree of correlation between aerobic rhythmic exercise and improved happiness. To be honest, even though my talk is going to ultimately be about strength training, I don't believe there is much research yet to show that there is a correlation between strength training and happiness. That's not to say that there isn't, it's just that there isn't the research to show it. But yes. So then also now in terms of improving muscle and bone strength, being able to lead our lives a little bit easier than we could before, one of the big things that we also see is that, well, because of having improved strength and quicker reactions and stronger bones, we are less likely to fall down. And one other thing to mention with that is when we do fall, we are less likely to get hurt. So of these things, these benefits of exercise and keeping in mind the guidelines that we see here for physical activity, when it comes to the guideline for strength training in particular and what it can help us with, it very much so helps us with these three parts. These three benefits come more so from strength training than they do as much from aerobic exercise. Not that aerobic exercise will increase muscle strength and bone strength, but resistance training will do that to a higher degree. And more so because of resistance training, improving our muscle and bone strength to that higher degree, we are again that much more able to carry out some of those daily acts of living, just picking things up, picking our kids up if we need to, holding them longer. And particularly with strength training in preventing falls, that is a huge way in which we can help to prevent ourselves from falling later on in life. So up to this point, I have been just talking though about exercise in general and its impacts on chronic disease and causes of death. However, just because we may not be dying yet doesn't mean that like we are leading great lives, that our lives as we are alive are all that comfortable and happy in a sense. So by that, like while we are alive, we want to ensure that our lives are being led to the best possible way that they can be. And so another thing that we ought to look at are what are the things that are associated with disability, where we aren't dying, but we may not be, again, living in the best way possible, we are living with discomfort otherwise. So if we take a look, this is again looking at stats in India in particular. If we take a look at the top 10 health problems associated with disability in India, we find that 2 of those top 10 problems are low back pain and other musculoskeletal issues. In the US, actually, low back pain is number 1. And from 2007 to 2017, it increased to a much higher degree in the US. And we see even in India, their low back pain is on the rise as a reason for disability. So in the US, we also have in our top 10, low back pain is number 1. We also have other musculoskeletal issues, and neck pain is another top health problem that is associated with disability in the US. So these are things that exercise can help with greatly by improving our muscle tone and muscle strength. When executed properly, can relieve those problems of low back pain and many of the other musculoskeletal issues that we experience from otherwise being inactive or even when we are active from not resistance training. So the reason this matters to me, and again, to tell you again, as far as background about myself, like I said, from when I was young, I've always been active. I've been in sports here. I was a swimmer when I was in high school. I was a rower in college. I've done triathlons, rock climbing, and later on now I heavy resistance train, and I do that to a fairly high degree. Now, in the moment, I do these because I like to be active, but one of the things that I consider is my future self and doing the things I can do now to ensure that my future self is set up well so that I lead a good life as I become older. An issue that we have, not just in India, but throughout the world as we get older, is that we fall a lot as a loss of muscle strength and as our bones become weak. Well, more so because of a loss of muscle strength, we find that as we become older, we have higher incidences of falling. Now, the issue with these falls and why it's more of a problem when we become older compared to when we're younger is that when we look at the elderly, and this is again looking at a review article on falls in elderly Indian adults, we see that in a lot of these reviews, what they're showing is that as a result of falls, these falls are deadly. Many people from that first fall, they don't come back up ever. And that is something that to me is a scary thought. Now, assuming you live through that fall, another issue that we have are just major injuries in terms of bone fractures, particularly at the hip, issues with the spine. If you are able to try to catch yourself as you fall with your arm, you may have wrist fractures or fractures in your arms. And while these aren't fatal, they lead to a loss of activity as you're trying to heal. And being older, you're not healing as quickly as you were before. Another thing that I think is particularly worrisome is the psychological impact that these falls can have on adults who, live to see another day. In that we see that with a lot of elderly, when they've had their first major fall, afterwards, they're very scared of falling again. And as a result of that, they start to restrict their activities and move less for fear that if they move the same amount they did before or more, they're going to be at a higher risk of falling again, and they don't want to experience that. And so that's a very unfortunate thing. But it leads into this cycle and this slippery slope or this downward spiral, where what we end up seeing amongst our elderly is that as we age in general, we experience sarcopenia. Our muscles become weaker. And some of that is due to reduced activity as we get older also. But so our muscles are weaker. We fall. Part of our falling is that when you think about it as an adult, more so, and it's probably weird that I'm showing it like this, but more so if I trip on something, I have the strength to catch myself. I have the strength and the speed to put my foot out in front of me or put my hands out in front of me to catch myself to actually prevent that fall. And so like I showed you in an earlier stat, Americans were klutzes. Accidents made the top, was number 3 in terms of causes of deaths amongst Americans. I trip all the time. I'm one of those who is guilty of not always looking where I go. But that being said, for however many times I've tripped, I can't think of the last time I fell down actually and hurt myself, because I've always been able to very quickly react, put a foot out in front of me, put a hand out in front of me and catch myself to prevent that fall. As we get older, because of that lack in muscle strength and the lack of that quickness, when we trip on something, we are then that much more likely to fall down. Now, and so that goes into these weak protective responses. We're not able to protect ourselves from that fall, again, causing us to fall. So we fall down, we get hurt. As a result of that injury, 2 things happen. One, we are now, again, scared of falling for another time. Between that and the fact that we are in this injured state that keeps us immobile for a while as we recover, and because we're older, it takes us that much longer to recover, we reduce our activity to an even greater extent than prior to that fall. Now, because of that reduced activity, 2 things happen. One, we are becoming more physically inactive. And as I was trying to show you before, due to that physical inactivity, we are at a higher risk for developing chronic diseases. On top of which, again, with that physical activity, our muscles are becoming that much weaker and we are becoming that much more deconditioned than we were before. Is there a question? I think not. Okay, that much more weaker than we were before. So now we're in an even weaker state, and we are then going to be that much more likely to fall and have an even greater impact or chance for injury or death because of that second fall. And in this way, we just go down a downward spiral. So for example, one of my uncles, he's in his 80s, older person, but very active, still goes shopping, goes to the market, goes to the bank, does everything he needs to do. But earlier this year, he fell on his way home, I think from the bank one day prior to COVID hitting. And I remember when I heard that over the phone, my first thought is like, oh no, this is the start of the end. Even though he walked as much as he did and he was active in that way, as a result of not strength training, his bones weren't particularly strong. His muscles weren't particularly strong enough to react to that fall or to not be injured as a result of that fall. And now it's the concern that like once you've had your first fall as an elderly adult, what's going to happen next? How is your quality of life going to be after that? So now to get into resistance training, because this is what I think about when I think about why I resistance train, and a reason for why I want to impart to you why it's a good idea to think about resistance training, and not just resistance training, but heavy resistance training. So what do I mean by heavy resistance training or weight training? Basically, I mean what it says in the name, lift something heavy. And by heavy, what that's characterized as is doing something that's somewhere between 70 to 95% of what you can do maximally for one rep. So 1 RM stands for a 1 rep max. If we look at the most that you can do on an exercise, do somewhere between 70 to 95% of that on a consistent, regular basis. Now, a lot of times when I say this, when my mom thinks about me doing heavy resistance training, the thought that goes through her head is that this is what I'm talking about, to look like this guy and to do what this guy is doing. And that with resistance training, 1, you're going to end up looking like this, and 2, that resistance training means doing this, having that much weight on a barbell so that you are making your muscles stronger. That's not what I mean. But that being said, while that's not what I mean, in some ways it is. So when we look at the different styles of resistance training where indeed you find yourself living with heavier weights, they tend to be bodybuilding as one. In bodybuilding, they lift fairly heavy weights to increase their size. Powerlifting is another sport where they lift very heavy weights to be able to just display strength. And Olympic weightlifting is again another sport where you lift fairly heavy, but with a lot of power to be, well, powerful. Now, in this case though, with these styles of lifting, this is what I mean by heavy weightlifting, but I don't mean go compete and you have to be these people that I showed here. I just mean it is worthwhile to consider adopting the styles of training that they execute for their sport, but to adopt it as a lifestyle way or in your fitness regime, basically. And a question that I see here is, don't I think that dietary habits is one of the reasons of body inactivity? I do believe that your dietary habits are a cause, or lack of good dietary habits is a cause of chronic disease, but it is not the cause of being inactive. I can be very active, but still have a very bad diet. And that bad diet won't keep me from being active. Likewise, I can have a very good diet and not be active. They're not particularly related to each other, but they are related to that mentality of thinking about your health and your future. And in that way, there's a relation that generally when you are more active, you tend to care a little bit more about your diet too. And both of those things come together to improve your health. And so to one of the other questions that we have here, as far as first, kids are in school. I am definitely going to get to that. That's actually going to be one of the next things that I get to. So let's start with, like I said, let's start with benefits of resistance training for young. And by young, I mean anyone who is under the age of 25-ish or so. Now, generally, there are many benefits of resistance training in terms of muscle strength, increasing bone strength, and all of that. But there's one particular benefit of them all that I'm focusing on here as a reason to try to convince you that heavy resistance training would be the thing to try. And that is the knowledge that as we age, there is enough evidence to show that when we are young, that's when we are most able to put on bone mass and increase bone density. We can increase that bone mass and density at the greatest rates when we are young. We see that that peaks around the age of 30, after which there's some evidence to show that you can still increase bone mass and density. However, it seems like more so what we can do after we hit our peak is to just preserve what we have. So as a reason for young to resistance train, maximal or heavy resistance training, it's because this is the time that you can accumulate all of that bone mass and density to the greatest degree, kind of like put all of that cash into the bank for later on, for that rainy day when you become older. And you can do this best at that age. I'm past that age, so I can't say that I can do that anymore. But that was one of the motivating factors for me when I was younger, is that I want to do what I can now to ensure that I have a better life when I am old. Now, in terms of what that looks like, as far as some of the studies that we see, this is a particular study I found looking at maximal strength training in particular, not just regular lifting a couple of 5-pound dumbbells, but doing something heavy. Where in this study, they took 30 women between the ages of 18 to 30, where again, these women are at that stage where they can maximally impact themselves to increase bone mass. This study involved a 12-week intervention where these women were told to execute 3 weightlifting sessions per week, where, this was very simple. All they did were squats. And at the beginning of the study, the researchers found out what was their maximal squat, what they could lift for 1 rep the most. And then they programmed to have them do 4 sets of 3 to 5 reps at 85 to 90% of that maximal squat. To allow for progressive increases in weight and to allow for that progressive overload over time, what they did is that as those women, let's say in the first week, they could do a certain weight for only 3 reps. When they got to the point of being able to do it for 5 reps, then the researchers added 2.5 kgs to the bar and then had them stay at that weight until they could do that weight for another 5 reps. And in that way, they over time increased the amount of weight that they did. So when we take a look at what happened as a result of that, TG is for the training group, CG is our control group. Just basically, I'm going to say this as a quick overview. These are all what we have here are tests of strength. RFD, rate of force development, is a test of power, and we also then are looking at peak power. In all of our tests of strength and power, we see that in the training group, they saw increases in strength and power, which we would expect because otherwise that wasn't a very good training protocol to carry out. But to me, what is actually pretty cool about this is all they did was squats, nothing else. And with those squats, they saw just squatting 3 times a week, they saw these increases in strength and power. Something I should mention with the control group is that they weren't just told to sit around, they were told to just follow the guidelines from the WHO and CDC in terms of how to be physically active in terms of aerobic exercise and whatnot, and kind of left them to do their own thing in that sense. So it is interesting because we do see that in the control group, they did see increases in power. So they must have been active in some way. However, there weren't really any increases in strength. And looking isometrically, there weren't increases in power in some of the other exercises that they found. But now bones, right? Like that's part of where I'm getting to in terms of we want to improve our bone mass and bone density so that as we get older, we have that in the bank to help us not fall and to not be as injured when we fall. So taking a look at markers for bone mineral density and bone mineral content, We find that in the training group, they saw significant improvements in bone mineral density in their lumbar spine and in their hips, which are two spots that are targeted when we think about where we lose bone and where we see damage, things that can result in low back pain and injuries when we fall. There were also increases in bone mineral content in these groups, the training groups, in their lumbar spine and in their hip also. So for young, when I say that we should be resistance training in our young, I do mean that we should be able to resistance train our very young too, have them participate in strength training activities. I've seen kids as little as 3 that are in the weight room doing some sort of resistance training activity. As they get older, when we're talking about prepubescent kids, having them strength train, and older yet, after puberty, as adolescents, or again, as we get older, all of them, they are candidates and are able to strength train to a high degree. But here's the thing. A lot of times I see that there's hesitation when it comes to strength training in the young, particularly the very young, because what parents tend to think as far as concerns to having their children resistance train is that 1, it will stunt their growth, and 2, that they are going to get hurt. So as far as the first, to be honest, I don't know where that concern came from. And that is something I hear, at least in the US, very prevalent among parents who are resistant to having their kids lift, is that they think it's going to stunt their growth. And there's actually just zero evidence to show that that is the case. And so I'm not really sure where that started from. In terms of injuries, and I see that there's a question and I will get to you in 1 second, but in terms of injuries, so actually what we see in children who participate in organized resistance training, we find that because their muscles and tendons, their soft tissues become stronger, they are that much more resistant to having soft tissue injuries compared to their other young counterparts who are not resistance training. Also, as children, one of the things that we know about them is they don't really have good control over their bodies. They fall all over the place. They're not very coordinated. They don't know how to move these bodies that they have. What resistance training does is, one of the adaptations we see is improved neuromuscular control. Being that neural adaptations leading to increased motor recruitment is an adaptation with resistance training, that adaptation carries over to these kids being more coordinated and having more control over their bodies. And they see an increase in their proprioception, which is an understanding of their body and space as they are moving and what their body is actually doing, so that they are more coordinated. And because of that, again, they're falling less, getting hurt less. We see that, as I was showing before, and one of the major things to me is that they have an increase in bone strength. And through that, as kids also, when they do fall, they are that much less likely to break their bones, having had participated in a resistance sport. And altogether, so in the US, like, it is very popular for kids to be involved in organized sports. And what's very interesting here is, in terms of the stats, there are more kids that get injured in their sport than there are kids who get injured from resistance training, even heavy resistance training. And because of those benefits that we see what resistance training does for these kids, they then are that much less likely to get injured in their sport. They have fewer sport-related injuries compared to those children that do not participate. So what is important here, though, is that we do this right with our kids. So that kind of gets to what is the correct age for a person to start power exercises. You can start them off really young. Now, the thing that we do need to keep in mind is that while our kids are uncoordinated, there are some things that they do pretty well. So just recently, one of my friends, he has a kid that's 2 years old, and it's been really cool to watch this kid grow up and see how he went from learning to just sit up tall to being able to crawl, to stand, to walking, and now he's running. And something that amazes me or impresses me when I look at little kids is that even though they are uncoordinated, there are some things they do really, really well. And one of those things that they do is that in some of these movements, like squatting, they do it so much better than adults do. At least I should say adults in the US. You get an adult in the US to try to squat and they they don't know how to move at all. But when we take a look at this kid here, which is the same thing that I see with my friend's child, is that his feet are nicely spaced apart the way they should be. He's got these nice vertical shins. He has a very nice neutral spine, vertical upright torso, keeping his body upright, not folding over. He has the mobility to get his hips nice and low. And somewhere as we get older, we lose that. So things that we do need to ensure with our young, which actually regardless of the age that you are when you start resistance training, these are things to keep in mind. If you do have a child participating in resistance training activities, you want to first and foremost reinforce moving properly and the right way to execute exercises. So as to one of the questions that we have here, in terms of exercises you use, so that gets to the next point, any sort of multi-joint exercise that involves many muscles working together helps to improve coordination. So doing something like squats, doing something like a bench press, doing something like a deadlift, which I will show you an example of what a deadlift is later on. These are all exercises that I think a lot of people think of squats in particular as being a lower body exercise that mainly impacts your quads, your hamstrings and glutes. However, it really is a total body exercise. It requires a lot of stability in your core and in your back. And even sometimes I feel it in my shoulders, where to be able to execute a squat properly with a barbell, you are engaging so many muscles, making them to work together to execute that movement. And so these are generally when I generally speak with people who want to go into strength and conditioning and be strength and conditioning coaches, we generally think of those exercises as being very basic, but it is those basic exercises that really help. Now a question, and so actually before I get to the next question, I'll just finish off the things that you should consider. Whether we're talking about young or we're talking about adults or elderly, when you do start, you do want to start with lightweight. You don't go and start with heavy weight right away. What you need to do is start off light, make sure that you are moving properly. And once that motor pattern is down, then you can slowly, progressively add more weight to improve your strength. What we see with kids is that prior to puberty, most of the adaptations they have are neural in nature, where they learn to recruit more motor units, make them work together, make their muscles work together better, so they have improved coordination. After puberty, when those hormones kick in, we start to see more adaptations when it comes to increased muscle size and muscle strength, or strength from within the muscle itself. So it is one thing to keep in mind, is that we can't think of kids as little human or little adults. They are little humans, and we can't think of them as little adults because they don't adapt in quite the same way. So prior to puberty, you may not focus so much on how much weight is on the bar or how much weight they're lifting, but focus on the movement pattern. That's where you'll do the greatest good. After puberty, that's when you can start to, knowing that they've already hammered down the proper movement patterns, you can now add weight to the bar. So in terms of one of the questions we have, does one need to undergo specialized training or have a trainer to learn heavy resistance training? So first, to answer that part, yes and no. There are plenty of people I know, so being that I resistance train, when I started lifting when I was young also, and I kind of just did what I could. There was no one to guide me or instruct me. I did more using machines. And so that's something to consider. If you are unsure of how to execute a movement, you may be better off using a machine in your gym, but machines that involve more of your body, not isolating one muscle, but using machines like leg press, or like the machine version of a bench press, or rows and things like that. Those might be machines that you use to engage many muscle groups. And with machines, it sort of guarantees that you aren't going to do it wrong. Other things that we do, when I talk to some of my friends who now lift very heavy, and when I talk about how they got into it, they just watch a lot of YouTube videos on people giving instruction on how to do it right. And they focus on themselves to ensure that they were actually doing it right before they progressed. And so that is something that can be done also. If you have the means to do so and you want to hire a professional, a personal trainer basically to help you, you can do that as well. But that's not always necessary. You just have to then do more of the homework on your own by watching videos or reading material to make sure that you are following the basic cues as to how to perform a movement properly. As far as, and so then the second part, from what you understand, improper posture might lead to damage. And you're exactly correct. If you are performing movements improperly, that is where you can have damage. So a lot of people, when they say they don't squat because their knees hurt, when I look at most of them, the problem isn't that they're squatting, the problem is that they're squatting incorrectly. And a movement I'll show later on is a deadlift, where a lot of people say, I don't deadlift because it hurts my back. And when I watch them, it's not that the deadlift is the problem, because it's actually a very great exercise for improving back strength in people with low back pain. The problem is that they're doing it incorrectly. And so one thing I can do, because I didn't include this component, but like at the end, if you guys want to ask about specific exercises, I could go through with you some of the key points to hit in terms of how to execute that movement properly. And I realized, so in terms of with the pandemic right now, going to the gym is a scary thing, and probably even more so there than it is here. So what I have told some of my friends here who at one point used to go to the gym, but don't anymore because, again, they're scared to be around other people and getting COVID. There are things you can do at home to still be able to resistance train in a way. So I joke about this with a friend of mine, but it's actually true. She loves to bake. And she goes to the store and buys 50-pound bags of flour so that she can bake. And that, at least in here, has been something that a lot of people do. They've been baking a whole lot during the lockdown. So I told her, like, hey, just grab that flour sack and do squats with that. Hold it in your hand and do squats with that 50-pound flour sack. And if that's all you have available to you, that's fine. But you can do that. And so you have things at home you can use. And for me, that was an issue too. At one point, I couldn't go to the gym. And so I just found things at home that I can use to be able to still maintain some level of strength than I could before. So you just have to pick out those household items, pick out the heavier things that you can carry, and then work up to even heavier things that you can carry, carrying it out with proper form. So then if we take a look at why should we resistance train as adults? Sort of the same benefits we see in kids, it's the same thing that applies to us now. We can build muscle mass, and having that increased muscle mass is just good for increasing our strength to be able to do things that we normally have to do anyway. So talking about that friend with a 50-pound flour sack, I think I remember going to the store. I was the one who bought it for her, brought it to her house, and I had to help her to be able to put it in her house because she wasn't quite strong at that point yet. And it would be nice if she were strong enough to be able to like go to the store, get it herself, and be able to put it away. What we see, again, as we see with our kids, is that an adaptation that we have with resistance training is increased neuromuscular coordination, which then results in improved balance, and we have an improvement in mobility, which is flexibility, movement through range of motion, where we still have control through that range of motion also. And lastly, because again, I'm structuring this as the overall, we want to fall and hurt ourselves less when we're old. We see that during this time as adults, we can at least maintain that that bone mass and bone density that we accrued as kids, if not accrue more. There is some evidence that, again, we can build a little bit more bone mass and density than before, but it's more so that we preserve what we have. So something I should have probably mentioned before, but we'll mention now, when it comes to all of the different kinds of exercises we have and how we would classify them. We could classify exercises as being low impact and weight bearing, like walking. We can classify exercises as being low impact but non-weight bearing, like swimming. We can also classify exercises as being high impact and weight bearing, like running, or high impact and not weight bearing, like weight training. Now, while these are all good for general physical health, it is really only these two that can then impact our bones, which again, I'm approaching this from making sure our bones are strong so that when we get old, assuming we survive and we don't, we're not taken down by other communicable diseases or, some chronic diseases, what's going to take us down is falling and the things that go along with that. These are the two things that can help with our bone health more so than the others. And so running is great because not only can it result in increased bone mass and bone density, but it helps you cardiovascularly to improve your cardiovascular fitness in a way that admittedly like heavy resistance training does to some extent, but not to the same extent. Now, the issue with running, though, is that the adaptations you accrue are specific to where those impacts are, which means you see increased bone mass in your legs, but there's no change in bone mass in your spine or in your upper body bones of your arms. So that's where supplementing at the very least with resistance training is a good idea, because with resistance training, you can impart that impact and load to your spine and to your arms so that you increase your bone mass and bone strength in your spine and arms, where again, if low back pain is a problem, we want to be treating our spines well also. So concerns that I see amongst adults as far as reasons for why they don't want to resistance train, at least these are the two big things that I see amongst even my athletes that I work with. When I tell them like, all right, put more weight on the bar, when they kind of say like, no, I don't want to, what ends up happening is a big thing is they say, I don't want to do it because lifting is just going to make me really bulky. And they think that if they lift, they're going to look like this. And this is what lifting means. And heavy resistance training is going to lead to. However, what I end up having to tell them, and so what I want to tell you guys is no, that isn't going to happen. A couple things, reasons for why that won't happen. So with maximal strength training, part of the exercise prescription for maximal strength training really involves lifting weights somewhere between 85 to 95% of your maximal capacity. And when you're lifting weight with that intensity, the number of reps you can perform for an exercise is somewhere between 2 to maybe 5 or 6 reps. It's a very low volume. Now, what most people do when they do resistance train is they use lighter weights that are of lower intensity, and they do these exercises with a greater number of repetitions per set. And so usually they'll do something between 8 to 12 reps in a set for like 3 or 4 sets. With what I'm showing you here, it shows you the various adaptations that are induced when you lift at different amounts of reps per set. And what we see is that with those larger rep ranges, the big thing that you change there is you do see increases in muscle hypertrophy and muscle size. Whereas training with heavier weight, you have increases in strength and power, but very little induction of hypertrophy. And so in fact, when it comes to athletic populations, when we look at sports where athletes are in weight classes, so like let's take wrestling for an example, wrestlers have to be in a particular weight class. They don't want to put on size because that means that they will have a harder time staying in their weight class. And so what you do for them is you make them just lift really heavy because it'll help with their strength and power without causing an increase in size. Another thing that I see with this, and I'm sorry because I can tell I'm going over a little bit on time, close to the end, I think, and I'll be quick. But another thing, particularly in women, like this is where it's most prevalent, that women don't want to resistance train at all, and they don't want to lift heavy because they're afraid of looking very bulky and looking manly. But something I can tell you is that part of what makes us unfortunately weaker than men is that we have very low resting levels of testosterone in our body, which is the big thing that contributes to strength and increases in muscle mass. And when we look at performing high intensity resistance training and the amount of testosterone we secrete as a result, what this shows is what's happening as you exercise and immediately after exercise in terms of changes in resting or in changes in testosterone levels, both total and free testosterone. For men, they see a huge spike in testosterone as they exercise with high intensity resistance training. Women, if it is significant at all, it's very low. And so there's very low testosterone in our bodies to be able to contribute to making us bulky in the first place, regardless of the kind of resistance training you do. So that kind of also leads me to a question that I have for you guys. If you think about someone, particularly a woman who's able to lift 175 kilograms, I had to like do the conversion because I actually think in pounds, but when you look at this, what do you think as far as how they must look? If you want to put it in the chat in terms of like, do you think that they must be very big, very muscular, or do you think that they would, potentially be smaller? They would have to be a bigger person. So like someone saying here, be around 75 or 79 kgs. Is that what a lot of other of you would maybe think, that they must be bigger to be able to lift that weight? I'm going to assume that maybe that's a yes, because at least that seems to be the general consensus amongst people here in the US. And so I assume that's normal to think. But that's not true. That's what I can lift. And that's what I have lifted. That's what I looked like when I lifted that weight. And so by saying that I participated in heavy resistance training, I compete also as a powerlifter, which is something I was waiting till now to let you know. But so another picture to show you, this was a couple of years ago, I participated in US Nationals for powerlifting. I placed third in that particular competition, but these were the top 5 competitors in my weight class. We were all in the 47 kg weight class. All of these women are incredibly strong. This woman right here, she can squat around 140 kgs. And yet look at our bodies. We are not big by any means. I've always wanted to be big and muscular, but it does not happen with resistance training. The only way you look like that picture I showed you earlier is if you supplement with performance enhancing drugs or steroids. Otherwise, you will not get bulky from resistance training or maximal resistance training. The other concern is that, again, lifting will result in injury, but this isn't true either. And that kind of goes back to the things that I showed you with the young. As long as you are performing the movements right, you take your time to progressively increase your weight, not adding too much too soon, you will be fine. You will not get hurt. So again, now when we think about our elderly and them resistance training, I just want to get back to, like, as I'm thinking about this, one of the things that is a concern to me is as I get older, if I fall and get hurt, then I'm done for. I very much value my independence, my physical independence, and being able to do what I want when I want. And as a result of being weaker, I wouldn't be able to have that. So when we take a look at elderly and what a high intensity program will do for them. In this particular study, they took about 40 postmenopausal women from the ages of 50 to 70 and had them do high intensity resistance training, where they were performing exercises at 80% of their maximal ability for 3 to 8 reps in these types of exercises. So to show you real quick, as far as what we see in these elder women who were able to do this high intensity resistance training, they found increases in their bone mineral density. There was no change in their bone mineral content. However, in the control group saw a loss of bone mineral content, which means that there was a preservation. And these women, obviously, with resistance training, saw an increase in muscle mass. Now, I'll go through this real quick, but it kind of says the same thing we saw before. With exercise, they saw an increase in strength and power also. And a big thing here is they saw an increase in balance. They had better balance than the control group, and they had better balance than they did before they started resistance training. So that kind of summarizes all of that. And sorry, I'm starting to talk a lot faster because I know I'm running out of time. In terms of these benefits for the elderly, then, we can preserve bone mass, which is huge for ensuring that if you fall, that you are less likely to break a bone, fracture yourself, or get hurt. And as a result of increasing muscle mass, increasing your power and speed and reaction, and increasing your balance, you're again that much less likely to fall in the first place if you trip on something. And so that kind of leads to that last thing. So then the last thing I want to just leave you with is, well, with our elderly, can they actually lift heavy weight? Like, can they do that? And what I'm going to tell you is that absolutely yes. These are some people who, this person here, she's in her 70s. And shoot, I know that weight in pounds. I'm trying to think of what that is in kgs. 50, 70. I think what she has on that bar might be around 80 kgs or so. I hope I'm doing that right, but I think that might be around 80 kgs. This man, he's in his 90s. And shoot, how much is on that bar? 50, 120, 125 is on the bar there. And this woman, she actually is in her 70s and she competes at the world level. She is very active outside of weightlifting. Like, she goes on hikes. She's able to do so many things that I see other people her age aren't able to do from lack of being strong and participating in these kinds of activities. So as far as the question that we have here, as a weightlifter, do I follow a strict diet? It depends. Right now I'm not competing, so I just eat to be healthy. When I competed, I ate a more strict diet because I also made weight classes. But now I still strength train to a high degree because I just want to be strong for my future self. And I eat healthy for my future self and my current self too. As far as another question, how emotional health can contribute to physical health. You know, they kind of go hand in hand, but what I can tell you is that physical health can contribute greatly to emotional health. So that kind of goes back to something I had said earlier in terms of there's a lot of evidence to show that being active can reduce those signs or degrees of anxiety and depression that people feel. And so even if you are in a deep, dark state, one of the big things, a sign of being depressed, is that you kind of hole yourself at home and you don't move around very much. And a big thing that people try to do is then to get you to just go out and move, even if you don't feel like it and you're unhappy. Just by getting out and moving, it can help improve those feelings of anxiety and depression. So it's more so that physical health and improving your physical health can help to improve your emotional health. So that's everything I have, but any more questions that you guys have? As far as is walking enough for elderly, that kind of gets back to, it is better than doing nothing. Because of the fact that you are moving and being active, that is definitely better than nothing. But that, if your other option is to not move at all and the only thing you will do is walk, yes, by all means, walk. But if you are at all motivated to do a little bit more for yourself, that's where I would say that by doing more, by adding resistance training and doing more by adding heavy resistance training, you will do yourself that many more favors than by just walking alone. Another question we have is functional training can be instead of weight training. For the person who asked about functional training, can you define for me what you mean by functional training? Because that's a word that we use a lot here too, but it means a lot of things depending on who asks that. What diet is better for increasing bone density? A healthy diet. As far as the diet, just eat healthy, eat whole foods, eat fruits and vegetables, eat less processed food, ensure that you're getting your calcium, like particularly again, when you are younger, get that calcium in to help to improve your bone density. As we get older, get that calcium in to maintain and preserve our bone density. And so, yeah, like that's, I know that that might seem very basic, but like one of the things I sometimes tell people here is, hey, if you're someone who just goes out here, junk food is huge. Everyone, so many people eat lots of junk food. So it's more of just telling them like, stop buying food from the store, make it at home. And even if you make something that's high fat, at least by making it at home, it's going to be that much better than what you were buying in the store. And from there, if you're just cooking with more vegetables and fruits, eating more whole grain type foods, eating rice, which many Indians already do, you know, that's going to be better for you. Let's see, it seems like there's a start of a question here. Unhealthy students do or do not, but I don't know where that question is going. In terms of telling you about supercompensation, what is this? Well, so with supercompensation, what that refers to is that after a bout of exercise, there's this period of time during which, because of the fact that you exercise, you've depleted your energy stores, your glycogen stores may be low, or your glucose stores are low. You've induced some degree of muscle damage from the work that you just did. And so there's this period of time when you are at a state where you're not able to perform as well. but that's okay. So like if you perform a workout, you do some sort of resistance training session. If you did it well, you exerted yourself, you should be tired and fatigued, and you shouldn't be able to do that workout right away afterwards. But if you give yourself a period of time to rest and recover, you see that in that time that you're resting and recovering, your body is fixing yourself back up. On top of which, because what training you did was a stimulus, and it was a stimulus that broke you down, your body ends up saying, like, we don't want to just get back to normal. We want to get ourselves to a state slightly better than normal, so that next time we're imposed, that stimulus is imposed on us, it doesn't do the damage it did the first time. And that's when you supercompensate. As far as when supercompensation occurs, it depends on what you did. So when you do heavy resistance training, particularly at higher intensities, you need more time to rest and recover. So it can be like anywhere from a minimum of 2 to like 3-4 days before you hit that supercompensation phase, where you're able to then do another heavy resistance training session. When you do things of lower intensity, it does less damage, it takes less time to rest and recover, and you hit that supercompensation phase much sooner. And so that's the thing to just keep in mind when we talk about not getting hurt with resistance training. The heavier it is, you need to give yourself a bit more time. The less intense it is, the less time you need between sessions. So let's see, some of the other questions, let me go back. So when you mean functional training as to which it's related in the actual activity, well, I'm still not certain I understand with the functional training what you mean, because I guess where I'm going with not understanding your meaning is that when it comes to exercises like squatting, that is a functional exercise. At least here, there are many times that we have to bend down and pick up heavy things. And in doing so, we are squatting and we are performing that movement. And so that is a functional movement. With using resistance exercises that involve multiple muscles working together, they are functional in that you find yourself moving in those ways in your daily activity. Doing something like an overhead press, that is functional. At least here, there are so many times when we have to pick things up and put it on a top shelf. So there's functionality with that. So in terms of other functional activities, that's why I'm still not sure I understand, Kala, what you mean by functional training then, because I would argue that resistance training is very functional. How do we make physical education more attractive online? That's a really good question. And one that I don't know that I have the answer to, and something I need to have the answer to as I try to market our sports sciences program for people to join into it. I think to me, what gives me buy-in and what gives me buy-in with my athletes in particular that I work with, or if I work with general population people, what gets them to buy into being more active and wanting to learn about it, has been to show them why it's beneficial, like what it will do for their health, to have an understanding of what they want for their lives and how physical education or being physically active can help them do the things they want to do in life to a greater degree. And so I try to appeal to that side as to a way to like get people to buy into being physically active. And so another question, like calisthenic workouts, is it enough for older people? Again, better than nothing. If that's the only thing you're going to do, great. But if you are willing to do more, again, there are benefits to resistance training, because with calisthenics, it does help with balance and it can improve muscle tone to a degree. But it doesn't do anything really to improve your bone density or bone strength or to preserve it. And so by adding something of higher impact, that will be the thing that helps with your bones in particular. And it helps with muscle strength and neuromuscular coordination to an even higher degree. But again, something is better than nothing. So whatever you're going to do that. It's, if you're willing to try and do something more, here's something to consider: resistance training. If you are going to resistance train without weights, like part of resistance training is to use weights, but then in terms of body weight exercises, push-ups would be a great thing. Pull-ups are great if you can work towards doing them. Doing a body weight squat is probably not enough to have an impact on your bones, but doing plyometric exercises, some sort of jumping activity, then will induce impact that can help your bones and also make you more powerful and speedy. So those are things that you could potentially add in when you don't have access to weights. Is pre-workout necessary before performing? No. You don't need to have any sort of pre-workout to be able to resistance train. I don't use anything. I get sleep, good sleep. That's my pre-workout to make sure that I'm ready when I go to the gym and that I'm well recovered. If you want to use some pre-workout, sure, but it's not something that is necessary.
Thank you, ma'am, for sharing your insights on the physical and mental health benefits of heavy resistance training from children to the elderly in a very systematic way with your excellent presentation. You have clarified all the queries which were put across. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Hope you all have a great rest of your day.
On behalf, yes, ma'am.
I was just going to say, like, if you have more questions, I don't know if you have my email, but feel free to email me if you would like.
Yes, sure, ma'am. On behalf of Indian Academy Degree College Autonomous, I take this opportunity to propose the vote of thanks to those who have directly and indirectly contributed to this webinar. At the outset, I thank the guest speaker of the day, Dr. Payal, for enlightening our participants with your informative talk. Thank you, ma'am, for sparing your valuable time to share your expertise with us. Thank you. I thank the Chairman, Secretary of Indian Academy Education Trust, COO of Indian Academy Group of Institutions for their unflinching support. My heartfelt thanks to our principal for constantly motivating and encouraging us to organize such beneficial programs. Sincere gratitude to all the participants from our institution and other institutions for your active participation. Thanks to Mr. Chandan, IT Manager, for the technical support rendered. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. Please fill the feedback form posted in the chat box. You will receive your certificates within 2 days. Thank you all.
Thanks. See you guys.
Thank you, ma'am.